Taking a deep breath in. And letting go. Coming into this beautiful moment once again, we breathe in peace, we exhale love. So today we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic, inspired by recent global events, especially with the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd's death, and all of the others. And there's just a lot going on right now. And I'm thinking maybe every other week, I want to at least kind of address some of this since it is such a current affair. And so today we're going to be talking about a lesson in morality, and then also some new teachings known as the Dunisha Flowers of Awakening. And so I'm going to be talking about, this is more of living earth stuff and Dunisha spirituality. And so I won't be specifically talking about current events, but just know that that is what inspired all of this, and it's going to apply to everything that we're seeing in the world right now. Does that sound good? So morality and non-duality. Those of you who've been studying living peace for a while may notice that we're really big on non-duality, and we really don't use the words morality all that much. And so we do our best to not say right, wrong, good, bad. We really try to avoid dualizing things and adding judgments to things. But then situations like this occur, and then people might say, well, don't you say that that's bad or wrong, depending on whatever side of the equation you're on. And then we get stuck. We might get trapped a bit because we've taken vows not to dualize, not to use the words right, wrong, good, bad. And so today I'm going to be addressing that and how we approach violence, how we approach harm, but coming from a place of non-dualism. So this is going to be a really important talk, especially for students who have been studying this for a while, and then new people who may not fully understand our stance on things, because sometimes we might be seen as too passive or being too neutral, and that's not really the case when you actually dive deeper into the teaching. So let's go ahead and take a deep breath in. So here's my beef with morality. I'm going to cuss for dramatic effect. But every fucking group thinks that they're in the right. And so it almost makes morality a moot point. Because think about it, almost especially like big global tragedies that really spread, it's interesting that there's always a justification. There's always a justification on either side. And so then it just becomes people pointing fingers at each other. And that's what's really fascinating, and I'm sure some of you who have grown up in Judeo-Christian religions, it's like at certain points throughout history, 100 years ago, a couple hundred years ago, there's always something that is, every tragic thing has been justified by the Bible, even slavery. And so it's so interesting that we just, as a society, we get trapped in these moralizing judgments and pointing fingers, but nearly everyone is thinking that they're on the side of the quote right. And so that's why in Dunisha, we transcend that ideology, that dual ideology, because we're able to step outside and recognize that we're not getting anywhere with just pointing fingers at each other. Does that make sense? And if everyone is justifying themselves with being in the moral right, then, well, it really does become a moot point. It loses its meaning. Does that make sense? And so how do we address this? Well, the first thing I wrote down I wanted to share is, do we have a moral obligation to help? So let's break that down. I have it written here. So moral is concerning rights and wrongs. And obligation is committed or bound to do something. So moral is concerning rights and wrongs, and obligation is committed or bound to do something. And again, because we're adding the word moral into the obligation, that can just mean so many things. And a lot of times, an example of this is how many times have there been wars on this planet, and then we rush off to war thinking that it's a moral war. But then, the aggressing party realizes that they were the aggressors the whole time. That happened in Vietnam. It happened in World War II. And so there's not always this ideology of this like a just war. that sometimes Americans, especially Americans, that we build our pride onto and that we're somehow the saviors. But a lot of times there's this ideology of we are in the moral right even to do these atrocities, and it's almost like an obligation that we have to show up for, if that makes sense. And so that's a very different story than what we might be doing along the lines of Dunisha. And so in Dunisha, we might, instead of a moral obligation, we might call it an inspired invitation. And so let's look at inspired. So given rise to. To inspire is to give rise to, an invitation is a request to act. Give rise to a request to act. There's no blind obligation, because a lot of times obligation is blind. Who's ever felt obligated to do something? You've been extremely resentful, and that leads to separation, and it leads to more judgment, and it can even lead to violence. And of course, we're removing the right and wrong out of it, and we're making it more come from a place of giving rise to a request to act, such as Dunshio Andrew, who's actually gone to various protests in your life, especially one this last week for George Floyd. It was definitely a given rise to an act, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. And so right there, just shifting the meaning slightly already softens the extremeness, because what we're really looking to avoid is extremist behavior within our being. And here's what's interesting is that anytime there's an extremist behavior in our being, no matter what side of the coin we're on, you see that harm arises from it, doesn't it? And so let's breathe that in. And so in Buddhism, they talk about, this is one of the main vows that monks adopt, depending on the sect that you are getting ordained in. It is to save all beings from suffering. So if you're someone who studies Buddhism a lot, you're going to hear that pop up. To save all beings from suffering, to save all beings from suffering, to save all beings from suffering. Well, again, as we have seen here in America, that sentence can be really misconstrued, because how many times have we gone into indigenous cultures and tried to save them? And we completely wreck their culture and their belief systems, and it gets destroyed without them even asking. So again, in the Western mind, to save all beings from suffering can be very judgmental. And although if you are embodying it from a very deep foundation of Buddhism, you understand how that goes without, extreme interference. In the Western mind, that might just be dabbling in Buddhism. It may not actually be helpful, because it might justify our behavior to go fuck shit up without being asked or given permission to. Does that make sense? So in Dunisha, we soften that and we say, to cultivate a life of peace and well-being for all beings. To cultivate a life of peace and well-being for all beings. What would that look like if you said that every morning, or you had that written on the mirror and you thought about that? To cultivate a life of peace and well-being for all beings, and guess what? You're included in all beings, because how many of us are actually having peace in our lives and well-being in our lives? A lot of people don't. So we have to make sure that we're not forgetting ourselves in it. And then as well as to cultivate peace and well-being, it really requires some deep listening of other people, doesn't it? Because again, we can't just go in and just assume what another person or party or group needs. We have to listen to them. And so now we're going deeper. This is some powerful stuff. Can I suspend my identity so that I may better listen, learn, and understand another's suffering? Can I suspend my identity to truly listen? It's difficult to understand pains we have never experienced, and thus it's important that we deny ourselves the privilege of an opinion regarding the unknown and uncertain. Let me read that back, because that might be a trigger for some people. It's important that we deny ourselves the privilege of an opinion regarding the unknown and uncertain. Because how often do we see things on the news and we develop an opinion about it, but really we don't know shit about it? And all of a sudden it may influence the belief systems that we're sharing with our family and friends. It will influence the way that we vote. It influences the way that we cultivate society. All the while, All the while, we're completely stuck in deep ignorance. And so it's so important that we go to the source and ask questions. And this is what cracks me up, because I'm really big on, if I'm ever looking at news, I always try to get multiple sources. I never just see a story and be like, that's true, even if it agrees with my ideology already. I always explore it, and then I will cross it over with more of the opposite party as well. That way I'm seeing all sides of the equation to really find the root of it. But what really has, what has really been fascinating to see is how many, in certain news networks, how many white people are just sharing opinions about what's going on without really actually going to source and asking Black individuals their side of the story. And so you're just seeing a regurgitation of opinion after opinion after opinion of people who can't understand, who literally cannot understand the pains of another person in this particular issue. Does that make sense? And so that's a perfect example of this, is that because we're looking at life through our own lens, we are stuck in our own identity and we're not able to fully understand the pains of another. So until we can release our identity, until we can release our own moral judgments, release our own biases, we're always going to remain ignorant. And here's the fun part, not really fun. We're always going to be a little bit ignorant. We can never be fully in the know about situations like this, because just naturally of our own upbringing, naturally of how we were born, naturally of our own culture that we developed. But at least by suspending our identity, we can at least soften it so much more. Does that make sense? So here's another big thing I really wanted to point out, and I'll probably be posting this quote. So this is just something I do want to add into the next book, but I thought about it. I'm like, hot damn, this is so true. We all have our natural political leanings, but it's important that we never dehumanize any other person or party. That's at the bottom of the left page. We all have natural political leanings, but it's important that we never dehumanize any other person or party. No matter where you're at, even if you were raised without any politics in the household, when you start to see things going on in the world, you are naturally going to gravitate to one direction or another, or maybe you're someone that's more just neutral and doesn't want to listen to any of it. That's still part of it. So you're naturally going to have a leaning, but your number one job, our number one job, is to make sure that we're never dehumanizing another person or another party. Does that make sense? And by dehumanizing, we can even consider that as getting stuck in duality, getting stuck in morality, where we see what someone else is saying, we say, that is fucked up. And they're a bad person because they believe that. I'm sure all of you have seen something or someone that has triggered you into wanting to judge them, and you can know that you're wanting to judge them because you feel you want to separate from them. You're like, ooh, I do not prefer what's coming out of their mouth right now, or what I'm seeing, how they're actually being stuck in this. Does that make sense? And so that's a part of dehumanizing. Dehumanizing is not just calling names and saying some really terrible things. It's also within us wanting to separate from other people because we view them less than for their beliefs. And that's a really hard pill to swallow, because sometimes we may not even recognize that we're doing it. So dehumanizing is anyone in your own mind that you are viewing as less than because of a belief system that they are holding, or a stance that they're taking politically, culturally, religiously. So how can we transcend that? And today, the rest of the sermon is all about how we can transcend this behavior, because whether we like it or not, nearly all of us do it on some level. And that's what's really hard to accept, that even in our blind ignorance, that sometimes occurs. And so it's important that we really take an honest look at this. So let's take a deep breath in. So in Dunisha, we vow to never dehumanize any other person. So we're gonna go into the virtues, 3 virtues of Dunisha out of 9. And we consider our virtues, we also call them flowers of awakening, because we're really big in the tree of life motif. And so you have your roots, the foundation, then you have the trunk of the practice, and then you have the branches of consciousness. And on the branches of consciousness, eventually flowers start to bloom. And the flowers that are blooming are the virtues that are going to be embodied. And so what's interesting is we treat our virtues like flowers so that we can nurture them to bloom. And when the conditions are met, that's when they flourish. And so we must look at virtues like flowers that need our tender care. Otherwise, they will never bloom. They'll never actualize in our being. Does that make sense? And you know that flowers have often a short shelf life, right? So we have to continue nurturing this bloom. We have to continue nurturing this flourishment. So the first one, this is when we get our fun fill in the blanks. The flower of honesty. The flower of honesty. Non-assumption. We do not feed gossip or speculation. So in the flower of honesty, we practice non-assumption by not feeding gossip or speculation. And that's why if I post anything or if I share anything, I always fact check. I fact check. Because I never want to accidentally feed in gossip or speculation. If I'm going to take a stand on something, I'm going to make sure that there is proof backing it up. Not just seeing a clickbait thing that took my interest and agrees with my belief system. Does that make sense? And then the next line, we do not use our words to harm. We do not use our words to harm. And that, of course, goes in your personal lives with your own loved ones when you get triggered and saying harmful things. But this especially now goes on to not sharing ideas and judgments online or with people that may agree with you and saying really nasty things. And by nasty, that's a judgment, so let's soften that. By saying harmful things that breed separation and anger. There's some people right now in politics that I strongly do not agree with. And a lot of people like to make jabs at these people and say really harmful things about these people. And I never affirm them. And sometimes I'll even soften them. Because I recognize that them, even if my ego's like, yes! I recognize that them by saying violent things about these people, they're embodying violence in that moment. And that's not the Dunisha way. Because again, even saying these things, you're embodying that energy in that moment. And you can still speak factually about things without being vicious in nature. Does that make sense? So we do not use our words to harm. And then lastly, but not least, the last line there is, we redirect our ignorance. We redirect our ignorance, parentheses, which is not knowing, and can also be our manipulation. Because sometimes it happens all the time online. And a lot of times when we might be in a debate with someone, we might leave out some facts just to make our point look more delicious. But that's a form of manipulation. And again, that's why I always make sure that I am redirecting my ignorance anytime I'm looking for the full facts of a matter, and I look at multiple sources, especially conflicting sources. Because if I'm only ever surrounding myself with people who agree with me, or articles that agree with me, or ideologies that agree with me, I'm going to be in ignorance. Does that make sense? So, going back to the flower of honesty, we must make sure that we're always speaking honestly about things and honestly about people. And so, who's ever vented about a loved one before? Right? Vented about a loved one.
Oh, dear God.
Yep. And so here's the thing. Here's a perfect example of the flower of honesty. When we are venting, we're not being honest. Because in that moment, we're only looking at the person's worst, right? We're only looking at the person's worst. when we're venting. So we're not telling the full story. We're just telling the ego story in that moment. Because then a week or two later, or even just an hour or a day later, we might feel a little bit better, and then we remember a lot of their positive qualities as well.
And then feel guilty about all the nasty things you said about them.
There you go. Yep, and the cycle continues. And so that's why to actualize and to flourish this flower of honesty, it's really important that we do make sure that we're always being honest with our words. And I'm not just talking about just little bitty honesties, I'm talking about the full picture. And when we can practice that, it really does help with our venting, complaining, the things that we might be speaking violently online, the words of separation that we share, and the words of separation and the judgments that we have. So even just driving down the road and someone cuts you off and then you develop a story about them, that's not honest. That's just one moment. I see people looking like, yep. So let's move on to the next flower, and it's the flower of gentleness. The flower of gentleness. And the next line is non-disruption. Non-disruption. We do not feed disharmonious energies. We practice non-disruption. And so this can manifest in we do not use our actions to harm. We do not use our actions to harm. And last line there is we redirect intensity. We redirect intensity. Who's ever felt like you were a very chaotic ball of stress? And how has that harmed people around you? Not only, obviously it's harming yourself, but it also, in your haste, you might be harming other people around you. In our hastiness, we forget to be gentle. And our energy becomes very disruptive. Every now and then, especially back in Arizona, I remember times where someone would come in late to a sermon and just make such a ruckus and then sit down and and then they have the paper and so it's even just disharmonious energies like that. But of course we don't judge that, because then you look at the psychology behind their disruption and we learn to help to calm it. But that is really, really important. Who's ever been listening to people and you're doing something else, you're multitasking, and so you're not even listening to the other person, right? That's very disruptive. And so learning to cultivate and flourish the flower of gentleness is we learn to be gentle in our daily lives. We learn to be graceful in all things. We learn to be mindful, adding mindfulness to every movement that we make. And when you're doing that, it's very difficult to keep it alive at all times during the day. But when you're doing that, you are so much less likely to accidentally cause harm. Like even yesterday, a couple days ago, when my parents stopped by and I was in the middle of writing actually this sermon. I'm just like, flower of gentleness. And then they knock and then I'm like, oh! And I noticed after talking to them, I'm like, I was a little more intense than I would have preferred to be. And because I was a bit distracted in my mind, I spoke a little bit too hastily. And I don't know if they noticed it, but I sure as hell noticed it. And I'm like, I could have added so much more gentleness to that conversation. Does that make sense? And so even small things like that. The last flower that we're going to talk about today is the flower of openness. And you can also put parentheses, understanding.
I really hope I spelled that right.
No problem. The flower of openness, parentheses, understanding. And then the fill in the blank on the next line is non-duality. We do not feed dividing ideologies. We do not feed dividing ideologies. And the next line is we do not use our beliefs to harm. We do not use our beliefs to harm. And the last line is we redirect emotions of separation. We redirect emotions of separation, rigidness. And so here's the interesting thing. This is kind of bringing it back to the start of the sermon, to where I was saying, you know, the whole moral obligation thing versus inspired invitation. In Dunisha, we don't use our beliefs to harm, and we practice non-duality. And so we never get trapped, and we never participate in conversations of morality, because we recognize that it's just a stalemate, because it's just people pointing fingers at each other. Instead, we take a step back, and here's the question that we ask. Here's the question. Use this, write this down. How is insert, fill in the blank, how is fill in the blank causing violence? How is insert, fill in the blank causing violence? And how can we remedy this harm? How can we remedy this harm without using additional force or violence? Without using additional force or violence. Can you read the whole thing back to me, Andrew?
How is fill in the blank causing violence? How can we remedy
This harm.
without causing further violence?
Yeah, without adding additional force or violence. Thank you. I didn't have that written down, so I just came up with it. So I'm like, oh, I need help. But that's so true. I've said this sentence in various forms in different coaching sessions and student sessions before, but putting it all together in this beautiful sentence is the first time. And it'll have to be in a book. But it's so juicy because that then brings our attention to the violence at hand. It stops the whole moral dilemma thing going on. And it brings it back to the actual issue right in front of us. That there is harm and violence occurring. And how can we solve this without adding additional harm? Because let's go on a micro level. Who's ever been in a yelling contest? And then it's just like harm on top of harm, on top of harm, on top of harm. So we do that, or guilt on top of guilt, on top of guilt, on top of guilt. So we do that on a micro level in our own relationships, where it's just like, well, if I just add more force, they'll hear me. Nope, doesn't work that way.
Especially when you live in a house full of siblings.
Yeah. And so you're gonna notice that you can see that occurring in the world right now, where a lot of times people are thinking, maybe if we just crack down harder, that will get people in alignment. But here's the fascinating thing, and we know this very clearly with our prison system. Punishment does not breed alignment. Punishment does not cultivate alignment. What cultivates alignment is understanding, deep listening, honesty, gentleness, non-duality, all of these virtues. And so we must make sure that we're not letting our ego or our adrenaline accidentally encourage us to cause more force, more harm, more violence through our words and our actions. And so now you can understand, when you're just talking about moral obligations, there could be a lot of duality in that. And in moral obligations, you might even say, well, we have an obligation to crack down and use force to shut this shit down. And again, that could be anything. I'm not just talking about what's recent. That happens a lot. But when we're using that as justification, we might be missing wonderful opportunities for deep listening and deep understanding to occur. Does that make sense? And so when we adorn these robes, either the brown robes or the black robes, or even just people who enjoy these teachings, we do our best to take a vow to never to dehumanize. Because if we do not dehumanize and view others as less than, we are more likely to not use force. But when you dehumanize, because just think about even just in your own personal lives, when you get upset at your loved one, you view them less than in that moment. And that's what justifies the separation. That's what justifies the use of force, the use of punishment, rather than viewing them as, we can just go with the flower analogy, a beautiful flower that deserves our tender care. that may be malnourished from their environment. And if we can understand the roots of the problem, we can so much more effectively foster a peaceful, healing solution. So let's breathe that in. Very juicy stuff. So we'll go ahead and close out our sermon for today. Thank you everyone who is either watching anytime. And if you made it this far, we deeply appreciate it, especially with today's talk, because it really is important stuff. And links will be down below for anyone who would like to explore more with Living Peace, with links to the book on Amazon or our student program. And of course, donation links are available as well if anyone would care to donate to our cause. Thank you very much, and blessed be.